Hello, welcome to the second in my series on how I use Inkscape for scratch building on my N-gauge model railway Chandwell. For this episode I'm going to show you some more of the basics, and I'm going to do that by answering some of the questions that you added to my first video, which was the absolute basics. Thank you for all of those people who commented on that, and I've put a link to it at the top up there so you can watch it if you haven't seen it already. So I'm going to dive straight in and we're going to have a look at the first question. What I have done is I've split this video up into sections or into chapters, so if you're interested in a particular section, they're listed in the description. You can just click the link and go straight to it if you want. My first question was from Elvenholm N-gauge model railway. Now, if you've not seen Stephen's channel, I do recommend you go and check it out. It's very inspirational. He's got a lovely layout and his videos are a great mix of watching his progress on constructing the layout and also some hints and tips on all kinds of aspects of modelling. So especially if you model N-gauge, but regardless of the scale, if you've not seen Stephen's channel, please go and check that out, and I've put a link to that in the description as well. Anyway, Stephen said he didn't have all the dialogues on the right of the screen when he was looking compared to the ones that I had. Now, I use Windows and I'd only just installed Inkscape version 1 and I just accepted the defaults that were there. Now, I've not seen it on a Mac, so I don't know how that works or how it looks differently, but I thought I'd just spend a minute just showing you the dialogues that I use all the time, and if they're not there, how to get them. So the dialogues are on the right hand side of the screen up here, and you can see I've got the layers one open at the moment. We can click the little arrow there and the whole set of dialogues disappear. That's useful if you want to have more space to concentrate on your drawings. And you can always get them back by clicking on the one that you want. So I had the layers one open there, so I can open that and make it bigger or smaller if I wish. So starting with the layers one, the layers are very useful. Essentially what it enables you to do is put all of your drawings into different layers, so different shapes into different layers. And I've got an example of how I use those layers here. So in my recent build, when I built a 13th century river bridge based upon one in Otley in Yorkshire, I used layers to help me build that. So I found an image of the bridge online in the bridge's conservation management plan, and I imported that into Inkscape and put it in a layer of its own called Image. Now I can see the bridge here and I can move it around if I wish, but what I can do is I can actually lock that layer. So if I press the padlock up there, that layer is now locked, so it's as if it's not there in terms of being able to select it, and that enables me to draw on top of that bridge and without fear of accidentally moving it. So once I've got that layer in place, I create another layer on top called Shapes. And if we click the little eye to show that, so we can show and hide layers at different points. So you can see there that I drew the arches on top of the image in a layer of their own. This was a way of making sure that I got the correct shape to those arches. And then I also used it for some measurements to make sure that it was the right size for N scale. So the document told me how wide this arch was. So once I scaled that to the correct size, I knew that all of the other bits and pieces that I drew on this drawing were the right size. So that was handy. Once I had the shapes, I can show and hide the background if I wish. On top of that, I then drew the main outline of the bridge. Now this is what gave me all the different bits and pieces to cut out once they were stuck onto card. So you can see I did individual wall sections, I did the buttresses for the starlings to attach to, all the separate shapes. And because all of those shapes are in their own layer, I can show and hide the background when I don't need it. And I carry on building up like that. I also use a notes layer to put individual pieces of text on to remind me what I'm doing. And because those are in a layer of their own, I can show and hide them as I need, and I find that really useful. So that's the layers dialog. I also use the align and distribute panel. So if we click into that, this enables us just to arrange shapes in various different ways. So if we turn on a layer that I've got set to show an example of that, so you've got lots of different pieces of lots of different red rectangles here. So if I then select them all and use some of the different arrangement buttons, we can show you how it works. So we can distribute them evenly, that's based upon their edges, or based upon an equidistant gap between them. So each one's now got the same gap between them. We can center them, we can arrange them to the top and the bottom and everything else. So it's fairly straightforward what that does. So I use it all the time when I'm drawing my scratch builds. So that comes in handy. So those two are the ones I use most of the time. And Stephen, in future videos, I'll always show you how to get back to those if they're not open. So for example, the layer one is on the layer menu where we click layers, and that will open the layers list. And the distribute one is on object, align and distribute, and that brings that one up onto the screen as well. So the second question was from Samuel Mason, who said he would be keen to know how I'd go about scratch building a house or terrace. So I'm not going to go into the full details of how I scratch build a house right now, but my next few videos are going to be how I'm going to build a mill. And the mill I'm going to use is going to be similar to this one in Bradford, because Chandwell is based loosely on Bradford. So my series is going to show how I start designing that in Inkscape all the way through up to how I finish it off. So Samuel, please do watch that. I think that'll be useful for you, or at least interesting. Just a quick one though, on Chandwell I had this space that I wanted to fill. I wanted to fill it with a little commercial building of some type. My son suggested a bakery, so we thought we'd build a bakery. So what I do when I'm building any building is I always measure the space first. So based upon the measurements of that part of the baseboard, I then built something like this. So I wanted to make it three pieces, a main building and two outbuildings. The larger of the outbuildings has an interesting cut off at an angle wall to fit on the side of the baseboard. So using those measurements, I just basically create rectangles, and then some of those rectangles I put a point on top, and then build a simple structure like this. All I then do is outline it, stick it to serial packet. This enables me to create a mocked up building just to make sure that everything fits. Once everything does fit and I know that that is going to work, I then build upon these shapes that I've created in Inkscape to add the windows, add the textures and everything else. So like I said, future videos will show how I do that, so do stick around if you want to and watch that. So the next question is from Paul James. He says he struggles getting textures imported into outlines like building walls and having them import at the correct scale without enlarging. Now this is probably the bigger question I want to concentrate on, Paul, because this can be a really tricky issue to get your head around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start talking a little bit about shapes and how we join shapes, and then we'll have a look at the textures. So first of all, shapes. As I said in my previous video, all of my buildings are based upon rectangles. So let's go for an absolute basic thing. Let's say a house. You might draw a rectangle to build a house. So there's our rectangle. Now, if you were just going to use that as the outline of something that you were going to stick some texture paper on yourself, you'd probably fill it in white and give it a black border. But you probably want to add some windows as well. So if you're going to add a window or a door, you would probably go about drawing another rectangle. So let's say you'd have a window there and a window there. You probably wouldn't draw it twice. What you'd probably do to get them the same size is you'd select the first one that you did and then duplicate it. So Control and D does a duplicate, and if you duplicate, what that does is it creates a second one on top. Then holding the Control key down, you can drag your mouse to the right or the left, and what that does is it keeps it level with the first one. If you don't have the Control key down, it moves like this. If you hold the Control key down, it moves like that regardless of where you put your mouse, or it moves downwards. So that's a good way of getting all your windows lined up without using the align and distribute that I showed before. But duplicate this one again and put it there. So you're now looking at the basic of your house. You've got your front of your house with its windows. If you wanted to print that, that's fine. But what happens if you wanted to colour in the house and you wanted to add some texture? Well, what we'd do is you'd select the outline window and you'd give it a nice kind of brick brown colour. And that's worked all right. You could probably print that out as well. But if we look, these are just white rectangles on top of the brown background. So if we were to have something like a spiral, and then we start to move the house around, first thing you'll notice is if I grab the rectangle, it's left the windows behind. And it's left the windows behind because they are not part of the house. So what you can do is you can select the windows and move them together, or you can even select everything and then group it by right clicking and saying group. Once it's grouped, everything moves together. But if we see, let's just bring the house to the top. If the house is on top of the spiral, you can't see through the windows. So the windows are still just literally rectangles on top of the back wall. So ideally we don't want that. So what we can do is we can cut the windows out. And to cut the windows out, we use one of the shape tools, which I use all of the time. So if you select the background and you select the first window, in fact, let's make the windows blue for now. Select the background and the first window, the window on top, just by holding Shift down. So click the background, hold Shift, click the foreground, and then we do path. We can do difference. And what difference does is it takes the shape on top away from the shape underneath and essentially leaves a hole. So if we to do that 3 times, and now we drag this around, you'll see that it's one shape. I don't have to group it, and if we drag it on top of the spiral, you can see through the spiral. And that's because that now has holes in. So if you're going to draw something like that, once you start adding textures, it makes it a lot easier to have the shape as an actual shape. Now you might also want a little extra bit of building on the side. You might want to make it a two level structure. So for that we can draw another rectangle on the side. And now we have the same problem as before. It's two different rectangles. So again we can group it, or we can make it into one shape. And to join two shapes together, so we used difference earlier to take the shapes away. To join them together, we use the union path command. So we select both shapes, holding Shift down and clicking them both, and we do path union. And what union does, you can see there from its little icon, it joins the shapes together. So if we click that, that's now made one shape, and that is the shape of our house that we're going to build. We might want a door in there as well. So what we can do is we can just draw roughly a rectangle to roughly the right size. I'm not even going to line it up to the bottom properly. I'm going to Shift click, click the brown one, Shift click the blue one, and do path difference. And you see there it's cut out the space for the door. So now we have one shape with all the holes in the right places. So that's now ready to add the texture. But before we add the texture to it, let's talk about how we get the texture scaled. So if you're using a texture that you've downloaded specifically at N scale, then you don't need to worry about the size of the bricks or whatever's on the texture as you import it, because it will import into Inkscape at the right size. However, here's a texture that I've downloaded from textures.com. It's of some old bricks, and it's just come in at the size that it is. That website, you'll get different sizes depending upon the quality that you choose. So I chose medium quality, and the bricks have come in at this size. Now to get it to the right size for N scale, we need to make sure that the bricks are going to print out at around about the right size of real bricks. I did a little bit of looking on Google, and the average size of a brick, or standard size of a brick apparently, is 215 millimeters long by 65 millimeters high. So I work in N scale, which is 1 to 148. So essentially divide the two figures by whatever your scale is that you're working in. So in N scale, a standard size brick will be 1.45 millimeters long by 0.44 millimeters high. So you can then use Inkscape's measuring tools to get this to the right size. So up here, we've got the width and the height. So I've drawn a simple red rectangle, and I need to make it 1.4527 millimeters wide, 1.4527, and we need to make it 0.4392 millimeters high, 0.4392. And if we make that high, then that brick is almost you almost can't see it. So if we scroll in very, very, very high, very close, there is our proper N scale sized brick. If we make sure that that's on top and we drag it on top of the texture that we downloaded from textures.com, you'll see that it's loaded in at much too large a scale for N scale that we're working in. So all we need to do is make it smaller. So to do that, we click on it once, and we see this bottom handle here. It's got a little diagonal left and right arrow. We can click that and start moving it. Now, if we just start moving it like that, you'll see that it doesn't maintain the aspect ratio, so we end up with very squashed tall bricks or very squashed wide bricks. If we hold the Control key down, however, it will maintain that aspect ratio so no matter how we move the mouse, it'll stay the correct size or the correct proportions. So what we need to do is we need to make it smaller and smaller and smaller until the bricks are around about the size of the brick that we put on top. And you can keep zooming in to see. So I'm still a little bit too big, and to zoom in I just hold the control key and move the wheel on my mouse. So we're going to carry on keeping control pressed down and keep making it smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually we'll end up with a brick around about the right size for what we're looking at. So I think that is close enough. So it doesn't need to be exact at this such a small scale, but now what we've got is we've got an image of some bricks which is around about the right size for N scale. So we've got that. We can then delete all of the other bits and pieces that we created to help with that. So how do we add this to our building? Well, let's get our house back. I'll remove the spiral. You'll see I've made that house way too big for N scale. Let's make it a little bit smaller. I don't need to know exactly what size it needs to be, but we'll make it small enough so that the bricks fit on. Now I've got one texture here which has got which is just big enough for my building, but in many cases you'll have a bigger building. My next video will show how I join the textures together so that you get one constant texture rather than something with a join in it. So how do we get that texture onto here? Now, one way obviously is just to drag it on top and take away the fill color, and then you could print that out and you could very easily cut around the black lines, and then you've got what you need. Obviously that isn't probably what you'd want to do, because you don't want to waste the printer ink because it costs more than probably anything else in the world, and two, it makes it a little bit awkward because you've got that problem again where you're dragging two things around separately. Now you could group them like I showed you before, but it is easier to work with if this was one shape. Now Inkscape has got a fabulous feature called clipping. And all clipping does is it says clip the image underneath to the shape of the image on top. Let's do an example. Let's say I'm drawing something which has got lots of different rectangles on, but I want it to be in a circle shape. So what we can do then is draw a circle on top, and just so you can see it, I'll colour in the circle. Now if we were to select all of those rectangles and group them, drop the circle on top. So with the circle on top, I select the group of rectangles, and then holding the shift key down I select the circle, and then right click and choose set clip. And what that has done is it is only showing the rectangles that are within the shape of the circle. So we've got a circular bit of rectangles, and I can change the size of it and everything stays together. So it's one shape that contains the rectangles that I drew. And you can get it back again by right clicking and clicking release clip, and that puts it all back to how it was. But for now we will delete all of that, and we're going to use the same technique on the textures. So we've got the outline of our house, which is one shape. Now this technique only works if you have done the previous bit, which is convert it into one shape. If you make it two shapes or multiple shapes, it won't work. The clip will only apply to one of them and you'll end up all confused. So do make sure you're starting with one shape. Just to be sure, I always work with shapes with no lines and just a fill. That way you see the shape that you're working with and it's obvious. So you position the shape into around about the right place that you want, and once you've got it in the right place, you click the texture and you hold shift down and you click the shape, you right click and you set clip. And once you've done that, there is your piece ready for cutting, ready for putting with other elements of the build and putting all together. Now what I would do with this, I might put some shading or something underneath the lintels or around the images, or put a lintel above the door and then maybe apply some shading. Might also apply some weathering at this point, just by soot stains and things like that, but I will show you that in a future video. We don't need to worry about that right now. So that is that. Paul, I hope that's gone some way to show you how I work with textures, and it's nice once you've got that you can move it around and do all kinds of things with it. So if you wanted to have the back of the image done, the back of the building done as well, you can press Ctrl D to duplicate it, drag it around and then flip it around, and then you've got the back side of the building as well. So that comes in really handy, it's really useful. So that is how I work with textures, Paul. Okay, time for a quick tip. This one's from Ozlodger. He wanted to know how best to draw a simple line with arrows at both ends to show the size of an object, example 100mm in those lines like that. So we've got our building, we want to measure how tall it is. We can use the measurement tool. So if we click the measurement tool there and then just draw the line from the corners. Now it'll snap to the corners so we can see, we can drag this line out to the bottom of the line we want to measure. And it says there that it's 27.17mm tall. Once we've got that measured, there's all kinds of interesting things we can do. If we click this arrow here, it's called mark dimension. If we click that automatically puts on that it's 27.17mm tall. Once we've got that, those are just normal shapes that we can do whatever we want with. So if we do that, that works perfectly. So that's one way of doing it. You might also be interested to know how big that is in the real world. Now obviously you can take 27.17mm, multiply it by 148 and get the result. Or if we choose the same measurement again, so we've got the measurement there, 27.17. See up here we've got scale and precision. If we make the precision 0, that'll get rid of the 0.17 if we wanted to. But the scale is interesting. So if we wanted to measure that as it would be in the real world, we need to add a percentage scale. So if we had 148,00, so 148 times 14,800. So if we then switch that to centimeters, say, and then click that, that comes out at 402 centimeters. But that is how we can do that. So that's one way of doing it. But Jeff wanted a specific one where he wanted the measurement within sizes. So if you want to do one manually yourself, you've got a couple of options. You can draw a line. So you can draw a line by holding the control key down, and that gives you straight lines, and then double clicking at the end. So we've got a line like that. Then if you go to the fill and stroke menu, if it's not open already, it's on Object, Fill and Stroke. And what we can do there is with the line selected, we can say we can choose the markers. So we can choose an arrow at one end and an arrow at the other end. So that gives us a nice line with the arrows on, and you can play with the widths and the sizes of the arrows. And then we can just use text. So by selecting the text icon and clicking, we can say 100mm. We can then select them both, and using the align and distribute, which if it's not open already, it's on Object, Align and Distribute. We can then say we want them in the middle, and we want them in the middle like that. So now you've got something like that. We then just need to add a little break. So if we add a wet rectangle like that, make sure that it is between the arrow and the text. So we move it back one, select them, put them in the middle, and make the arrow white. There's one example. So then you select all three and you right click and you do group, and there's your arrow complete. You can then, by clicking on it twice and holding the control key down while you move this, you can get it to 90 degrees if you wish. So that's another way of doing it. That's the way if you want to do it manually, but I tend to use the automatic way like that, which we use the measuring tool for. If we come back to the measuring tool and we're going to measure across the diagonals here, you might like this line where it puts the angles and everything on as well. What we can do is we can press this button here, convert to item, and what that does is it creates an actual item which you can move around and interact with. And if you put those on layers of their own, then they stay in place. And that's brilliant if you're doing things like track measurements and track plans to get the radius of curves and things, and that looks really good. So that is that. That is how I work with measurements, Jeff. Hope that makes sense. Hope it's of some use to you. Please give it a go and let me know how you get on. So John said he would have liked to have seen me printing it out and assembling the cutouts in the finished product. So first of all, John, I don't print directly to card. I always print to paper. If I'm printing something just for background or just for structure, I just use bog standard 80 GSM Tesco value copier paper, which I then use glue stick to stick onto card. I use glue stick and then I press it down with a wallpaper roller to make sure that it sticks quite well, and I use normal glue that I get off eBay. If I'm doing something with an actual texture on it, it's going to become the finished print. I use 120 GSM matte photo paper from eBay. I use quite thin paper, 120, it's not very thick, simply because it makes it easier to fold that paper around the card once it's on the card. Anything thicker, it tends to bend and the print comes off and it doesn't work very well. I like nice crisp lines. And I use the printer, it's just a Canon MGS 5700 printer, and it's got separate ink tanks, which is nice for this kind of work because you'll find that the ink runs out at different rates. I use the ultra print quality setting on that for the actual prints themselves, and I find that gives a great surface and really nice tight image that comes out. So I always print onto paper and I just stick to card. My next episode, where I talk about actually building a building, you'll see everything that I do from step to step, focusing on Inkscape, but I will show you how I put everything back together as well. So please, John, subscribe if you haven't already and watch that video, which I'll be starting very soon. I've got no more tips for this video. The next video I'm going to start actually building something, as you've seen, and there must be at least 50 arches on Chandwell, so I've drawn a lot of arches in Inkscape, so I'm also going to do a video where I talk about how I get the most out of arches. If you found that useful, please let me know in the comments. More importantly, if you found anything confusing or if you've got any questions about using Inkscape to scratch build, please add comments below as well. I will answer those in my next episode. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.